Hey guys, what is going on? Narcissus here from The Gaming Project. Final Fantasy is one of my 3 all-time favorite game series. There really isn't a Final Fantasy game that I don't like. Okay, alright. That's not necessarily true. But for the most part, I really enjoy the series. So today I'm going to go through and order all of the Final Fantasy games that I like from least to greatest. Why, you ask? Because these types of videos are some of my favorite to watch. I love them. I love discussing and debating which games in the series are best. It's fun. Now, let's establish some rules for the list. I will only be covering the main titles in the series, so 1 through 15. In the cases of 13, 4, 7, and 10, which have more than one entry, I will be combining them together and rating them as a whole. No spin-offs will be counted, so no Final Fantasy Tactics, no Type 0, none of that. Also guys, unfortunately I'm not going to include Final Fantasy 11 and 14 on this list. It's not to say that I don't like them, because even currently right now I am playing Final Fantasy 14 and I love it. I think it's wonderful, it's great, I'm having a blast. But they're MMOs. I believe they're in a whole different category, and it's hard to compare them to the rest of the series, so unfortunately guys, I will not be including them in this list. As always everyone, this is just my opinion. It will more than likely differ from yours, but that's okay, because I'm just stating my opinion, and we are all entitled to them. Before we get started though guys, make sure to subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. So let's get started. Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II's story centers around 4 young individuals whose parents die in a military attack on their town. 3 of the 4 young individuals join a rebel group to counter this oppressive evil force. The game uses random encounters to initiate battle, just like all the first 10 Final Fantasy games do. Now, to be honest, I don't necessarily hate this game. The story is compelling, combat at times can be difficult, but plays pretty good if you don't accidentally walk into an area that have monsters overpowered beyond the player character's levels. What I hate about it is that you can only save on the world map. I believe this mechanic totally ruins the gameplay. You are unable to save in dungeons before boss fights or in dungeons at all. This feature really hinders the game to me. Players will almost have to go out and grind and become over leveled before even entering a dungeon to avoid mishaps of dying and having to replay the level. If they would add saves to this game inside of the dungeons, it would move up several places for me. And hey, maybe they have done that, but I've only played the PS1 version of this game, and that is the experience I am rating this on. I have not finished Final Fantasy II. I made it probably halfway before I got tired of not being able to save. Also, I'm not a big fan of being in an area where you can handle the monsters, then take one step left and be in an area where it's too overwhelming. So Final Fantasy II has earned last place on my list. Final Fantasy IV. Man, I know how pissed everyone's gonna be. This game is one of the most popular games in the freaking Final Fantasy series. I know it everybody, I really do. But I can't lie. This is the place Final Fantasy IV falls on my list. Final Fantasy IV is about a knight named Cecil who turns out to have a very unusual origin. You are out to stop a sorcerer from taking over the world by using the world's 4 elemental crystals. You come across and use a variety of characters ranging from monks to dragoons to white mages and so on and so on. Final Fantasy IV received a second game, Final Fantasy IV The After Years, many years after Final Fantasy IV's initial release. I never played this game and won't really go over it, but just wanted to include it for the viewer's sake. So this is where I'm going to get a ton of thumbs down, and it's by placing this game way back here on the list. But I don't care. This game is not good. You go through the game and the only consistent character you get is Cecil. The game gives you character after character after character to use, but only for a short duration of time. Then the final party that you are forced to use are a bunch of heavy hitters and a healer. They lack diversity in abilities. You are not allowed to switch out for other people you have used in the game, and it's crap. Then the story starts out really good, but then takes a huge swerve toward left field. It's just all over the place, and I did not enjoy it. Plus, don't get me started on the final boss. He is impossible to beat unless you achieve a certain level, which is also shit. I had to level up for 4 hours just to beat him. My experience with Final Fantasy IV was poor, and I know Final Fantasy IV is really popular in the Final Fantasy community, but I thought it was one of the worst. It is the only Final Fantasy game that I can say I dislike fully. Final Fantasy I. So Final Fantasy I is Final Fantasy at its most basic level. You play as 4 Heroes of Light, or also called Light Warriors. Each of the 4 carries one of 4 elemental orbs, which have been corrupted by elemental fiends. So you have to defeat the fiends, purify the orbs, and boom, game 1. Pretty simple. Combat is turn-based, and each character has a class or job that they can perform, such as white mage, black mage, and etc. So why is this game so low on the list? No real reason. I just feel like the game is sort of bland. It lacks the amazing story or awesome gameplay mechanics that is seen in other newer Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy I created a good foundation for the Final Fantasy franchise, so I am definitely not dogging it or anything. In fact, I am singing its praises because some of the later Final Fantasy titles are amazing, and they took many aspects from this starting foundation. I have played Final Fantasy from start to finish, and I did enjoy it fully. Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII is one of the most beautiful Final Fantasy games in the series. The story takes place in a world called Cocoon that has a government called the Sanctum. This government is pretty corrupt, and it purges any people who have come into contact with Pulse, which is another layer of the world located down below. You play as Lightning, an ex-soldier who went rogue from the government due to her sister being marked by a god from Pulse. She attempts to save her and is joined by a ragtag group of people, which includes her sister's fiancé. It is quite a tale, which I found kind of confusing my first playthrough. The combat in the game was very strategic but slow. I'm not going to give a long explanation on this because it would take way too long, but it uses an ATB with several slots and players can set commands to each slot. You can also switch your group's job classes mid-battle using the paradigm shift mechanic, which definitely mixed up the Final Fantasy formula. Like I said, this has to be the prettiest Final Fantasy game aesthetically, with its gorgeous environments and wonderful character designs, but besides for being pleasing to the eye, there is little I can compliment about the game. I will say combat can be fun, and you definitely have to be paying attention so you can change your paradigm configuration when needed, but the battles are slow and drawn out. I'm sorry, but if a random encounter takes more than a couple of minutes to handle, then there is something wrong. You could spend upwards of 20 minutes on just a random encounter. The story was slow paced and, like I said, kind of confusing because a lot of different things had very similar names and I kept getting mixed up on what was what. Exploring new areas did not give me the sense of exploration like most Final Fantasy games do, due to the area layouts being too linear. Finally, I did not like how summons worked. I am kind of old-fashioned where I like a summon to come do one big giant ultimate attack, or it being able to kind of do its own thing. I do not like using summons as characters, nor do I like using summons as a vehicle. Shiva Sisters motorcycles? Nah, no thanks. Now, I don't hate 13 or anything, I mean it's too pretty to hate, but I was disappointed in it when I first played it, and never could afterwards play the other two in the series. I want to though, but god, there are just so many other better games to play. So Final Fantasy XIII, rightfully so, sits back here towards the back of my favorite Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy III. Now this is a good Final Fantasy game. It is a lot like Final Fantasy I, where it's just the basics, you play as 4 orphans who were granted power by the world's crystals. They set out on a journey to save the world. This game is also the first in the series to allow players to change their job class. I love the freedom and diversity that changing job classes allows to players. The story in Final Fantasy III is a bit bland, but the gameplay is significantly better than its two predecessors. I made it about halfway into this game but never finished it because of life and me having to walk away from gaming for a bit back when I first tried to play it. What's funny about Final Fantasy III is that it originally released on the Famicom only in Japan, where it sold extremely well, and never made it to the US and Europe until 2006 on the Nintendo DS, which is just odd to me since it was very successful in Japan. I feel like Final Fantasy III is one of the most overlooked Final Fantasy games in the series, and I don't understand why. Don't let the game being placed this far back on the list fool you, as it is a must play. It is only this far back on the list because the Final Fantasy series just have that many good games. Final Fantasy VI. This is another amazing game in the series. I feel like Final Fantasy VI took a lot of ideas from Final Fantasy IV and done them right. As you play, you come across and are able to use many characters that have a lot of different abilities or job classes. The story is very fun and engaging with a lot of laughable moments, and the characters are lovable and have a lot of depth to them. Combat is turn-based and fun because you must use your brain to figure out how best to handle different battle situations. I really only have two complaints with this game. For one, the main villain should have played a larger role. Yeah, you can argue that he did. I mean, he did kind of fulfill his goals, but you only see him a few times and he could have been better used. My second problem is in like the last third of the game, you lose all of your team and then have to go out and find them all. This is fun, I guess, but they kind of shift main characters at this point. Finding all of your team could be a pain in the ass, especially when your main team members are gone at the end of the game. It was frustrating to me, and I had to use a guide to find them all, but some people might like this, and I understand why, but I personally didn't. Anyways, this game is still amazing, and is again a must play, and is one of the most popular titles in the franchise. I played it for the first time on Steam because the load times were way too slow for me on the PS1, but everyone had their own opinions on how to play it, so just pick one and enjoy this game like I did. With that, guys, I am going to end this video. I decided to split this video up into two parts so I could avoid making it too long. Make sure to find and watch part 2 of this video if it's out, and if it's not, make sure to subscribe, ring a ding that bell to stay notified on when it does come out, or just do that anyways. I would really like to hear from you guys on what your favorite Final Fantasy titles are, so drop a comment down below to let me know which ones are your favorite. Until the next project, guys, though, take it easy. I'm out.